to Sports. My name is Nathan Simmons, and with me, as always, is Nathan Kwan. Let's dive right into the NBA, specifically the Houston Rockets, who've had a rather up and down week since the trade deadline. Kwan, take it away.
Yeah, they finished off a 2-1 week this past Wednesday with a big win over the LA Clippers. They started the week in a win against the Minnesota Timberwolves. They won, getting 142 points in regulation. They were lights out shooting the three-pointers, but the warning signs were there. I mean, after the game, the team talked about how bad they were defensively, and especially on the rebounding front. They got out-rebounded 58-31, which is really an astounding number if you think about it. Minnesota seemingly got every offensive rebound, and that's really what kept them in the game until late in the fourth quarter. Minnesota was coming off a back-to-back where they had flown in from Minnesota the night before. They were tired. The Rockets were rested, and they just outworked them. And the Rockets won, but the warning signs were there for what happened Monday night, in which the rebounding again reared its ugly head. They got out-rebounded 54-39. They started the game off 18-2 up on the Pacers, but the combination of the rebounding, the lazy transition defense, poor defensive rotations, they shot 10 of 45 on three-pointers. Eric Gordon especially shot only 3 of 11, and he was an overall net of -20 when he was on the court. The final defensive play when the Rockets were down 2 and they needed a stop, where James Harden was caught ball watching on the baseline out of bounds play and CJ Miles hit a dagger 3, was just the epitome of what happened that game. And then they bounced back on Wednesday night, as I mentioned. They shot lights out from 3. Everything they did wrong on the boards on last Saturday and on Monday, they resurrected on Wednesday night when they out-rebounded the Clippers 42-19 through 3 quarters. Patrick Beverley was a beast. He was everywhere. He was hitting threes. He scored 14 points by himself in the third. He was grabbing offensive rebounds. He was taking charges. And so, again, this team is proving that its ceiling and its floor is about a wide as margin as you can get. And part of that comes from the way they play, just shooting so many three-pointers. It's a make or miss league. And so some nights you're just going to be hitting every 3 in sight. Some nights you just can't hit the ocean from the beach. And so that some of it comes with that, and some of it also comes with just the way that they rebound and play defense. It's just been really inconsistent. Collectively, they can be a solid defensive team, and we've seen that in stretches this year where they've held opponents under 100 points and really have not individually defended well, but like collectively rotated well and rebounded. But that's really been up and down. And so I think the ceiling for this team is really like the NBA Finals. If they can find their groove defensively and hit threes at a high clip, they can beat anybody. But I mean, their floor is also like a first round exit, because especially on the boards, if they run into a team that has size, like a Memphis, for example, this team could go home early. And yeah, and so the gauntlet continues this week in terms of the schedule. They play the Grizzlies tonight, at the Spurs on Monday, and then Utah, and then at Chicago. So this stretch of schedule we mentioned a couple weeks ago on the pod would really determine where this team ended up in the Western Conference standings. And so far they are off to a good start with the win in LA, but we'll see if they can keep it going. Right now they are 3rd place in the West, 5 games behind the Spurs, and so at this point they're probably a long shot to get the 2 seed, and they're actually 5 games ahead of the Jazz as well. And so it's not so much about the playoff positioning, because I think they're pretty much locked into that 3 seed, but they just need to play more consistently on the defensive side of the ball.
For sure. And like you were saying, like, I mean, this team is kind of like the Golden State Warriors without Kevin Durant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I mean, it's just like lacking that interior presence. It also kind of reminds me of like sort of like Don Nelson era Dallas Mavericks, who would like rely a ton on like 3-point shooting with like Nick Van Exel and obviously like Dirk and Steve Nash and Michael Finley, but like never really had much of an interior presence. Like they would trade for like Ralph LaFrance or like have Sean Bradley or Eddie Nahara, but like it was just like they could go like from one end to being like a team that could probably like beat like prime Spurs to then like losing in the first round to like Sacramento. At the end of the day, though, I mean, it's a very exciting team to watch. And I mean, even though like they had an up and down week, this was the teams they played were all teams that look to be like in the playoffs this year. So it's not like they've been playing scrubs this week, and at least sort of bodes a little bit well for this upcoming schedule. Even though it is a gauntlet, these are still like teams that I could very easily see them beat, especially this Memphis team who just last night lost to the Dallas Mavericks, who have been on a tear this entire week ever since the trade deadline, starting with the first game of Nerlens Noel's tenure against the New Orleans Pelicans, and then they ended up beating Miami, and then a close loss to Atlanta, which that game wasn't even decided until like pretty much the last minute. But even then, like the Mavs were very much within reach of winning that game, and this past week has pretty much kind of destroyed a lot of Team Tank's hopes of maybe getting a first overall pick, and we might actually fall out of the top 10 overall range, which might be a little bit scary. But what's scary is like how good Nerlens Noel is going to be. He has, ever since joining the Mavs, he has 36 points and 35 rebounds, culminating in last night's game, which he had 15 points and 17 rebounds, along with 2 huge blocks, one on Chandler Parsons and one on Marc Gasol as he was trying to dunk the ball. And it's actually a really amazing play. If I could maybe like link the highlights to Nerlens Noel's game last night, but he just basically like he was just straight up going for a dunk, and then just like Nerlens Noel just like pops the ball out, and so the only thing that like Marc Gasol has once he reaches the rim is his 2 hands. But on top of that, Nerlens Noel is not the only one who's been performing very well. Seth Curry has been playing a lot like his brother. In fact, probably surpassing him to some extent, because he now actually hits his threes at a more consistent pace. He had 29 points against Miami, but he also had 31 points against Minnesota, and then last night he had 24 points. And he's been doing a very good job of facilitating the ball and again shooting the 3 very well. And he's also a very capable defender. And then on top of all that, you have both Harrison Barnes and Yogi Ferrell doing their thing. And Dirk is slowly but surely approaching 30,000 points. That should be very exciting. Definitely try watching the next 4 to 5 games of the Mavs. He should be able to reach it by then. But this upcoming homestand, they have OKC, the LA Lakers, Brooklyn Nets, and the Phoenix Suns. 3 of those teams are in the running for the top 3 picks in this year's NBA draft. They're the 3 worst teams. And then you have OKC, which is mostly just like Russell Westbrook and friends. And so this upcoming week could really determine whether or not this team actually ends up making it in the playoffs, or if they even get a top 10 overall pick. And right now, I'm leaning towards this team actually making it to the playoffs. Like this has become an absurd team to watch. And like I was hoping they would still be able to tank, especially after releasing Deron Williams. But it looks like losing Durant actually helped, and that's been a scary thing to think about. And like at least the good thing though is that like this team next year should be very good. Hopefully they're able to sign Seth Curry after not this year but next year to a very lucrative contract to keep him as their starting shooting guard. But yeah, this Mavs team seems to be ahead of schedule, and a little bit scared about how they're going to try to fill in the point guard of the future now. But again, no big deal. And also shout out to Yogi Ferrell, who won Rookie of the Month for the Western Conference this past February. So going from a 10-day contract to Rookie of the Month, pretty good.
Yeah, so you mentioned the playoff race for the 8th seed in the West, and it continues to kind of go back and forth. Denver's still in the driver's seat. They have a 2.5 game lead on Portland, which had a big win against Oklahoma City on Thursday night. The Kings they've lost 3 in a row since that initial win without DeMarcus Cousins. They are 3 games back, and then the Timberwolves and Mavs are also tied 3 games back. Minnesota's been playing better. They were a trendy pick to make the playoffs this year. We'll see if they have enough left in them to make a push. And then, as you mentioned, the Mavs and the Pelicans, really, they've lost 4 or 5 since they've gotten DeMarcus Cousins. And so as we predicted last week, it was going to be tough for them to get to the 8th seed, and looks like it's not going to happen this year for that team. But let's move on to the Eastern Conference. The Cleveland Cavaliers, you alluded to it, they made a couple signings this past week. They got Darren Williams, their backup point guard playmaker that LeBron James has wanted, as well as center Andrew Bogut, who will really provide an interior defender that they had wanted in a potential playoff matchup against Golden State. They're looking strong. They are 3 games ahead of the Celtics for the number 1 seed in the East. There's an interesting battle going on between Washington and Toronto. They played a home and home, and they each won on each other's home court this past week, and so they remain tied for the 3 seed. Washington currently has a tiebreaker. But the bottom of the East is also, there's been some movement. Chicago has played a little bit better since the trade deadline. They have moved up to the 6th seed. Indiana had a big win in Houston. They are also in the mix at the bottom of the East. But the biggest NBA news this past week was Kevin Durant. He was playing a game in Washington in his hometown for Golden State, and he suffered a sprained MCL and bone bruise. And so initially there were thoughts that he might be out for the rest of the season, but he's going to be out at least a month. And right now, the Warriors are only 2.5 games ahead of the Spurs in the Western Conference for the 1 seed. And so San Antonio is coming off that very successful rodeo road trip, and they're one of the hottest teams in the league right now. And so, Nathan, do you think Golden State can hold off the Spurs for that top seed?
No, I really don't. I mean, like, granted, I saw the game last night between the Spurs and the Pelicans, and I mean, granted, like, while the Pelicans have been struggling this year, they almost won that game against the Spurs. But even still, I mean, Kawhi Leonard has been playing completely on fire. I mean, he's like, he not only is he the defensive stud that we know he is, he's finally coming into his own as one of the top primary scorers in the league. And obviously you have LaMarcus Aldridge, and on top of that you have Patty Mills, who looks to be able to replace Tony Parker, South Park on the mind, my bad. But yeah, and you have Popovich too, and I think Popovich is motivated with like having a young group of guys as his core to really go after that first seed and be like, okay, be able to sort of like test them and have them have that under their belt, because like we're now like sort of like living in that sort of phase in which they're now transitioning from one core of 3 players that were like Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili, and now going towards Kawhi, LaMarcus, Patty Mills, and obviously Danny Green too. Like, I mean, it's sort of a ridiculous team too. And on top of that, they also have like Pau Gasol like at the 5. And I mean, and granted, like Pau's not what he was before, but I mean, he's still providing a pretty good production for that. So I mean, I think the Spurs team is going to pass the Warriors. I thought at first that there was an outside chance of maybe the Rockets passing the Warriors, but like you said, like there's just the Rockets are too far behind the Warriors at this point. But I mean, really though, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Warriors can hold steady to that 2nd seed, especially since like they're beginning to look more like the Rockets than they are the Spurs, in so much that they themselves don't have that interior presence, and they really rely on that 3 ball. So it's definitely going to be interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely some concerns right now with Stephen Curry. He's struggled with his shot the past couple games, and they're going through a pretty tough schedule as well, where they are on the East Coast playing a lot of games back to back, and then they have to fly back to California for one game, and then they go back out to the East Coast for another road trip. And so for a Rockets fan perspective, this kind of it would speed up a potential Rockets-Warriors matchup, especially if Golden State falls to the 2 seed. That would be a second-round matchup with that team versus a potential conference finals matchup. But I do think this shows how hard it is to win a championship. Golden State came into the year coming off 73 wins, and they got Kevin Durant. And just one fluke injury where Marcin Gortat throws Zaza Pachulia into Kevin Durant's knee. And now that game too. Yeah, and now Golden State, I mean, this is not the same team that won 73 games last year. They don't have Harrison Barnes, they don't have Andrew Bogut, they don't have Festus Ezeli, and so any notion that the Warriors will just go back to how they played last year without Durant, it's not the same team, and we're seeing that the past 2 games where they've lost.
Yeah, I mean they had to give up on the depth that they had in order to sign Durant. So I mean, like Durant was their entire bench, if that makes sense from last year. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to some spring training news. So, the Astros, in terms of wins and losses, they didn't really have a good week. But a couple players that did have a good week, Jake Marisnick, he had 3 hits yesterday, including a home run. He's had the starting center field position the last couple of years, and he's been an outstanding defender, one of the top outfielders at running routes and making outstanding catches. But his bat has never really come on. And so, if he can have any semblance of a decent offensive game, that could make the outfield mix very interesting, because coming into this year, they signed Nori Aoki and Josh Reddick. And so the outfield is really loaded, and Marisnick really was slotted in as kind of a fourth outfielder, defensive replacement guy. And if he can add anything offensively, I think that complicates things for AJ Hinch. Charlie Morton, who is probably going to be around the number 4 starter for the team, he had his first start. He pitched 2 scoreless innings against the Mets yesterday. It was a pretty successful outing. It was his first start since he tore his hamstring last April. He allowed 1 hit, 1 walk, and threw 33 pitches. He was 94 to 96 miles per hour on his sinker, which is good coming back from an injury. And so it's good to see Morton have a good outing. Will Harris left Tuesday's game with groin tightness, but he says it's nothing serious. And so no news is good news on that front. You don't want to see any injuries. And a couple of spring training invitees that are unlikely to make the team had some rough pitching outings. Brad Peacock, who has been up and down throughout the last couple of years, he's out of minor league options, and so he didn't have a good outing. He'll probably have to pass through waivers to go back to AAA, or another team will claim him. Brady Rogers is a young pitcher. He came up briefly last year down the stretch, but he got shellacked as well in his pitching outing, so he's more likely going back to AAA.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the Astros. I mean, you shouldn't worry too much about the whole like losing streak, especially at the beginning of spring training. But yeah, it looks like they're trying to like work out a few kinks here and see like who makes it in. I mean, the progress for Jake Marisnick, who I know was a highly regarded prospect with the Marlins before he got traded over to the Astros. It's nice to see him like begin to start putting some things together. I mean, he's a great defensive. He was always a great defensive outfielder, like you said. And if he can at least like contribute something while batting, like that's going to be a huge plus for this Astros team. So let's move over to the team also in the state of Texas, the Texas Rangers, who've had a slightly better week in terms of wins and losses in spring training. The biggest notes coming out of these last few games this past week has been Delino DeShields and his ability to finally get on base, specifically his ability to draw walks. I mean, Delino has been known for his speed, maybe not necessarily the best base runner or even the best fielder in terms of route running, but he's been able to always like use his speed in order to cover up those small errors that he might have. But now he's finally getting on base, drawing those walks, and causing havoc on the base paths. And not only that, he's stealing a lot of bases, which is nice to see. It looks like he might be able to sort of return to that form that he had back in 2015 when we first got him as a Rule 5 draft pick from the Houston Astros. It has a very good chance of winning that 4th outfielder spot, especially with some of the news that we'll talk about a little bit later. But right now, 2 people that are kind of struggling, though, have been the newest Rule 5 draft pick that they got, Hauschild, who's supposed to at least fill in a little bit with the bullpen. He's really been struggling, and the big thing with that is that because he's a Rule 5 draft pick, he has to be kept on the 25-man roster, either active or on the DL. But the thing about that is that like if he's not going to be able to contribute, then like they might have to try to get creative in trying to work around him. And AJ Griffin, who's been in the mix to be bottom rotation pitcher for this Texas Rangers team, just like he was last year, he's been okay but inconsistent. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how they carry these two together, especially since they're not really going to need that 5th starter until like the 16th game of the season. due to how the off days work out for them within those first 2 weeks. Another big disappointment has been Hanser Alberto, who always had trouble hitting, but who could always rely on his defensive prowess to be a utility infielder. But he's been muffing a lot of balls in the infield, and has just not really seem to be able to lock down that position right now. So he might lose it to Drew Robinson, who was tearing it up last year in the minors. Even though he's a bit old for a prospect, but even still, just not really. That might be a very interesting battle going forward. There's been a few small injuries. Beltre, being the old man that he is, old but amazing baseball player. He's recovering from a strained calf, but was able to play in Friday's game. And then Cashner has bicep tendonitis. I mean, again, with him, like it's more about whether or not he can help fill out the bottom of the rotation. But even still, would have been nice to see him be able to do that. And then Sam Dyson has a sprained wrist, but he'll likely be okay. But it's going to be something to definitely monitor, as he's also going to participate in the World Baseball Classic this spring. So we'll see how that goes. But I would say probably the biggest news coming out of Rangers spring training has been the fact that Josh Hamilton, after last week, his knee being considered okay, he's somehow tweaked it in between this last weekend and this weekend. And he now had to go in and get surgery and is out for the next 2 to 3 months. And the implication being that not only Delino DeShields being the de facto fourth outfielder, but also making room for someone like Drew Robinson or James Lone or even Will Middlebrooks to come in and fill in with that bat off the bench. And so that kind of like brings up the interesting thing, since this is beginning to really look like this might be the last time Hamilton might be an MLB player. But with Hamilton's surgery history and just sort of like how his life has sort of spiraled a bit downward in terms of his own personal life since the Los Angeles Angels, whether or not he should have actually gone out and joined that Angels team, even though they offered more money. Because not only was it not like necessarily great for his personal life, I mean, he ended up sort of like the pressure, from what I can tell, it looks like the pressure kind of like got to him a bit, and he ended up divorcing his wife and kind of losing his family prior to ending up and going off the wagon, which ended up leading to him being traded to the Rangers for pretty much nothing. If he had stayed with the Rangers, whether or not all this could have maybe been avoided to some extent. My view. Well, you go ahead, Quan, first.
My opinion is those personal problems are outside of baseball, and it could have happened in Texas as well. I mean, we'll never know. I just think his game, in terms of just his bat speed, just kind of declined over time, and he was never really able to hit like the breaking pitches and read those as well. And is that a fair assessment?
That's a pretty fair assessment, but I mean, I think at the same time too, like, I mean, his personal life and baseball, sort of like professional life, have always been very intertwined, because with Hamilton, he's always had trouble with like addiction, but baseball in a way was his outlet from like his addiction to drugs, in a sense. Like when he was able to like sort of like be able to focus on baseball, and in a sense like be like, and I'm putting this in like quotes, like air quotes, but like addicted to baseball, through that he's been able to sort of stay clean and all that. And on top of that, you had the Rangers who always knew his situation and knew sort of how to handle him and have a good support group around him, versus him going to like the Los Angeles Angels, who granted had C.J. Wilson on that team, who was pretty much like his closest friend with the Rangers through most of the like 2010, 2011 time frame. But even with that, the Angels didn't know really how to sort of like cater towards like making sure he didn't go off the wagon, and sort of like put this extra pressure on him to deliver without worrying about that. And then, I mean, again, I don't know what happened necessarily with the marriage, and whether or not that could have been avoided in with the Rangers, or whether or not that's necessarily been like as big a thing as I think it might have been to his psyche. But I think he probably would have done better had he stayed with the Rangers for a bit. But at the same time, like I still remember like that second half of 2012 and how he just sort of started swinging at everything. And I think maybe at that point he was just like, even then he might have been losing a bit of his focus on baseball, and whether or not that might have continued on further with the 2013-2014 season. But we'll never really know, I guess. It's an interesting what if for sure. And then to wrap things up, the Rangers are set to retire Pudge's number 7 jersey on August 12th, a game against the Astros. So it's nice to see someone who just elected Hall of Famer getting the further recognition he's always deserved and was probably going to be given to him whether or not he made it to the Baseball Hall of Fame. But congrats to Pudge.
Congrats.
Let's move on to the NFL.
Yeah, so some news and some cuts, notably this past week. The Vikings have decided to move on from Adrian Peterson, and so he's out on the open market. He's an over 30 running back, hasn't really played a full season in a number of years. There are rumors linking him to Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. What do you think about that, Nathan?
I think I'd be kind of fine with it. I mean, I know we right now have Alfred Morris, but Alfred Morris was not very good last year. And I mean, like, Peterson would, I think, for sure be a great improvement over Morris. No offense to Morris. I'd be fine with it, but like, I think it really depends on like the money he's willing to take. Like, if he's willing to take like a huge, like in a sense, like hometown discount to come play for the Cowboys, not like prevent the Cowboys from being able to sign other free agents that they actually really, really need, like maybe a second wide receiver or obviously like a defensive end or a cornerback or safety. As long as he doesn't prevent that from happening, that'd be fine. But like Peterson kind of is a little bit of a luxury for them at this point, considering that they have the best running back in the league right now, who just finished his rookie year and would have been rookie of the year if it weren't for his teammate. So yeah.
I mean, it's really basically, does he value playing time, or does he value like the opportunity to win a championship? And if he values playing time more, then Dallas isn't the place for him. And also like the financials as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And he's not the only one that's hitting the market too. You also have Jamal Charles, who just got cut from the Kansas City Chiefs, former UT alum. It's going to be interesting to see with him, since he has like a pretty big injury history himself. Also, Brandon Marshall being one of the many veterans being cut by the New York Jets. What are your thoughts on those two?
Well, Charles, I think it's the end of the road for him. He's had so many knee problems the past couple of years. Tore his left ACL in 2011, right ACL 2015, and then last year he had more operations on his knees. And so I think it's the end of the line for him. But what a great career he's had! All-time leader in Kansas City history for running backs, for rushing yards, 43 touchdowns, for a four-time Pro Bowler. Like coming out of Texas, I think really he surpassed all our expectations. I mean, he had a good career at UT, but when he was at his peak in Kansas City, he was one of the top running backs in the league. And every year in fantasy football, he was one of the top 2 picks, and you could depend on him for his 5 or 6 yards per carry every play. And so if this is the end for him, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a team that's going to take a flyer on him to see if he has anything left, but a good career for Jamal Charles.
For sure. And not only that, he's not the only UT alum who surprised us with his work with the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, obviously the big one is Priest Holmes, who set then the record for number of rushing touchdowns in a season back in, I think, 2003. But yeah, I mean,
Derek Johnson as well.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. I mean, they love their Longhorns in Kansas City.
Yeah. So some news closer to home. The Texans announced this week that they wouldn't use their franchise tag on cornerback AJ Boye. And so interesting that they didn't choose to go that route. They had this same situation a couple of years ago with safety Glover Quinn, where they decided not to use the franchise tag on him. And they let him test the open market, and he ended up signing with the Detroit Lions. And so, I mean, the team has said that they want AJ back. We'll see what the financials look like. As a Texans fan, I want him back on this team. Was one of the most improved defensive players in all the league last year. And the Texans do have a little bit of depth in the secondary, but you can't let a guy like AJ Boye leave for nothing. And so, I mean, we'll see how the market turns out. If I were the Texans, I probably would have used the tag. Just him being a breakout player, I guess you always have another year just to see if this was just an anomaly or whether or not he is one of the top corners in the league. And if you use that tag on him, you have another year to kind of assess his value in-house. And now you're kind of risking him getting a huge deal from some other team and you not being able to match that offer.
Exactly. Yeah. That seemed like a very odd decision by the Texans, especially like they didn't use their franchise tag on anyone else, right? So I mean, they could have.
No.
I mean, they're like, I don't know. I mean, I guess they're pretty confident that they can sign him without the franchise tag, but we'll see.
I mean, if they didn't have 19 million tied up to some shitty quarterback, then maybe they'd have money.
Yeah, maybe. You never know. You never know. If only. Yeah. But yeah, on top of that, other big news coming out of the rumor mill, DeMarcus Ware might be coming back to the Cowboys. I mean, I for one would be hecka stoked for that. I mean, DeMarcus Ware will go down as one of the greatest defensive players of all time, and arguably one of the greatest Cowboys of all time as well, which is saying something considering the history of this Dallas Cowboys team. I, for one, would be fine with bringing him back because at the very least, even though I don't think he's definitely not what he was back in his peak, back in his prime, but at the very least, he would be able to give good sort of like mentorship and leadership to that defensive side of the ball and be able to sort of at least like pass down some of the information, some of the tips and tricks that he has from playing in the league for at least 10 years to all of our very young defensive linemen. So that should be good. Some of the biggest news, though, is this past week is the fact that the NFL Draft Combine is happening, and some interesting things definitely occurred. What popped out to you, Nathan?
Yeah, I got a notification yesterday. So linebacker Reuben Foster, who is projected as a potential top 10 pick, was sent home from the scouting combine yesterday for a heated altercation he got into with a hospital worker. Apparently, he was waiting for a pre-exam, and he grew very impatient for the wait time, and he began questioning the worker. The worker didn't like what Foster said, and they got into a face-to-face heated exchange. And so the kind of absurd of the NFL Draft Combine has this top 10 prospect might have potentially hurt his draft stock with this incident while he was waiting for an exam.
Yeah, that's just insane to me that you couldn't have waited like maybe an extra like 5 minutes. I mean, granted, I wasn't there. Maybe he was taking a really long time, but like, I mean, that lack of patience could have very easily cost him. Like, I mean, I don't think he gets dropped out of the first round because of this, but I mean, he goes from like overall top 10 pick, someone that was actually even like discussed as possibly even being top 5, but he might very well drop to close to the 20th overall pick, and that's a pretty big pay cut.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, if I've been in waiting rooms for dentists or doctor offices, and if you have an appointment and it's like 30 minutes past, it does get frustrating. I get it, but I mean, this is a different situation.
Yeah, like this is because like the draft combine is also kind of a job interview too. So I mean, like you got to. You can't give them any sort of like awareness of like, oh, this guy might have some character concerns. But yeah, I'm sure he's a nice guy at the end of the day. I mean, yeah. But on top of that, also in terms of Longhorn news, Dante Foreman, who is considered one of the best running backs in this draft, the doctors discovered that he had a small fracture in his foot. He doesn't need surgery, but they ended up having to hold him out of workouts at the combine. And he's still going to be able to run and do like the 40-yard dash and all that at UT's pro day, but definitely not good news for him. Considering also that one of the bigger knocks on him was whether or not his health could sustain himself in the NFL after being pretty much the workhorse of UT's offense and getting 50 carries against in a losing effort to Kansas.
I said it at the time, but I did not agree with what Charlie Strong did with him. You talk about like the NFL going into these like 2-back systems where you kind of limit the carries. To have a college player carry the ball that many times, I think is absurd. And granted, he was very effective in your offense, but you can't put that on a player to do that.
Yeah.
in my
Yeah,
opinion.
especially if this could very easily affect like how much money they make as a professional once they graduate from college. Like that's just that was very like to me boneheaded by him, especially since like that was their strength was like the number of like running backs they had, but it's neither here nor there. I mean, hopefully he's able to turn it around and have post a good 40 at the pro day, but not good news for him.
Right.
I will say that. But let's move on to something that we haven't talked about too much, which is the NHL Trade Deadline. I'll quickly go through this one since this is like it was a far busier trade deadline than last year's, but even still, I mean, it's the NHL. But I mean, I like the NHL. Whatever. Big news in terms of local sports teams. The Dallas Stars were very busy. They had 4 trades. One was Patrick Eves, who they traded to the Anaheim Ducks for a conditional second round pick, which could become a first round pick if the Ducks make it to the Western Conference Finals and if Eves is able to play 50% of his games with the Ducks. I mean, kind of hoping for that first round pick, even though that would mean rooting for the Ducks, but it's neither here nor there. I mean, the fact they were able to get a second round pick for someone that that was kind of considered a first round bust in 2003. The fact they were able to get something like that is pretty good. Jordy Ben, who's the brother of Jamie Benn, who is one of the best players in the NHL. He got traded to Montreal for a 4th round pick and a defensive prospect that doesn't project to be like all that good, but still, he was also an undrafted free agent himself. Jordy was, and the fact they were able to get a 4th round pick is pretty good. And they also traded Oduya for another 4th round pick and a first round, someone that was considered a first round bust. Again, like it looks like they've been pretty much stacking up on draft picks. They might have. A lot of people are saying they should have gotten more, but I mean, again, like you just have to consider like how they got each of these players and like what was expected of each of them, and the fact that they got anything for these guys, I say is a pretty strong plus. The biggest trades though that happened in the league. Kevin Shattenkirk, long considered one of the better defensemen in the league, got traded from the St. Louis Blues to the Washington Capitals to help further shore up that defensive core. I mean, the defense that they have over there was already pretty good, but the Washington Capitals have always struggled in the playoffs, and they're right now trying to hedge their bets and try to get Alex Ovechkin to the Stanley Cup for the first time in his career, which is, I mean, if they make it to the Stanley Cup, it was long overdue. And then Ben Bishop, who was for the past 2 years prior to the season was considered the one of the best, if not the best goalie in the league, got traded to the Los Angeles Kings in order to help back up Jonathan Quick. It looks like, who's also considered one of the elite goalies. So it's going to be interesting to see how they switch those two and balance those minutes. But yeah, that pretty much wraps it up with the NHL.
Hey, Minnesota Wild, baby. Ex-Houston Aeros affiliate, top of the Western Conference.
That's true, yeah. And they did trade for Hansel from the Arizona Coyotes in a very, very good trade, I would say. And that should really help them in the playoffs. And I mean, we'll try getting someone else on for to help further talk NHL. But I mean, it's at least shaking up to be an interesting playoffs this season. Unfortunately, it's definitely not going to include the Dallas Stars. But yeah, let's move on to the Big 12 basketball. Women's basketball starts this weekend. UT at number 2. But the biggest news right now in women's basketball is not UT women's basketball, but Baylor women, and it's not for their play on the court. Do you want to sum it up? What happened?
Yeah, so it was at the end of the game last Saturday. Baylor had just clinched the Big 12 regular season title, and they were doing a celebration on the court. And Kim Mulkey, the head coach, made some interesting comments. She brought up the investigations into the Baylor sexual assault scandal that led to Art Briles being fired as head coach and kind of put a cloud over the whole university for the past year. And she said that if somebody around you and they say, I will never send my daughter to Baylor, you knock them right in the face. And so I think given the assault charges to Baylor, you're advocating more assault. to defend your university, I think is a very poor choice of words. And of course, she released a PR apology on Thursday saying that I'm sorry for this choice of words. Timing wasn't good, poor analogy, but I'm an emotional person. Nathan, you have some thoughts on that?
I mean, to me, like, what a snake. I mean, just, I mean, it's not even just a poor choice of words, because, like, I mean, it wasn't even just because she went, not only did she, like, say, like, oh, like, to punch someone if they say, like, they're not gonna, because she's, like, advocating to, like, physically assault someone who's showing concern about the well-being for their daughter in terms of, like, where they're going to send their daughter to school, which is a fairly decent thing, I would think, in my point of view, especially considering, like, the problems of sexual assault across campuses nationwide. But I mean, she went on to also say that, like, oh, you guys keep reporting this, and you guys should focus on other things and all that. And it's just like, she knows what happened. Like, these are, like, the people that got fired or had to step down were her bosses and her colleagues. Like, she knows what happened, and she should know that the fact that, like, no one's really kind of been held accountable for any of this at all. Okay, the football team, they straight up targeted like volleyball players and all that, on top of, like, other people, like students at the university too, who were unfortunate enough to cross paths with them. And you want to tell them to get over it? What is wrong with you? Hold them accountable. Are you? And the fact of the matter is that also she's, like, the most important woman in Waco. She has so much power because whenever she talks, they will listen. They respect her, considering, like, how much she's been able to do for that university. And the fact that she uses her platform to completely dismiss this whole thing is ridiculous. And it not only that, I mean, it sort of just, like, reflects, like, the entire, like, culture at Baylor of just sort of dismissing and covering up for the football team. And it just, I mean, to me, I think that entire athletics program needs the death penalty. Like, I mean, I know it's been, like, it's not been the most popular decision ever since what happened to SMU, but I mean, like, that program just needs to stop. Like, there's something in the water at Waco. And I mean, it's not just, I mean, and the thing about it also is, like, this is, like, the third scandal out of Waco. Okay, I mean, come on. There's something seriously wrong with that town. I will say that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think they've always kind of had an inferiority complex to bigger schools in Texas like A&M and UT and even Texas Tech to some extent. And they kind of finally got on the map the past couple of years with their football program being successful under Art Briles. And I think some of that comes from, like, you're just trying to tear down, like, everything we've built up. But, like, to me, this is not about sports. This is not about your university brand. This is about crime and humans and students. And it's not about, we're not attacking your players personally. We're not attacking, like, the brand of your university as in, like, your fans. We're attacking the people that did the crime and the culture that was cultivated there and wasn't accounted for by your administration. That's what we're attacking. Okay. I mean, I think it's just something that they've always felt that they've been kind of overlooked in the state of Texas. And this is, like, another thing to kind of take them down a peg, but this is definitely not that. This is about a crime and a culture.
Yeah. I mean, like, your Baptist private school, like, if anything, the one thing that you should be good at is, like, trying to, like, uphold morality. And you can't tell me that, like, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you shouldn't punish rapists. I mean, like, I remember, like, my Torah portion for my bar mitzvah, like, my Torah portion was about the rape of Dinah. And the thing, like, while I wouldn't exactly advocate this as the punishment, like, what happened with that story was that after, like, the rape of Dinah, like, the sons of, like, Jacob went out and, like, straight up, like, killed the entire family of the rapist, and that's, like, I mean, they took rape seriously back then. Don't tell me you can't take rape seriously now, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
God, it just really pisses me off. Like, I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep it PG, but I'm just like,
I totally agree, my brother.
Yeah.
Well, let's get back on the court. So the men's basketball tournament for the Big 12 is going to come up next week, along with conference tournaments around the country. They've actually kind of already started in some of the mid-major conferences. But Kansas and Baylor are the two front runners in the Big 12. Kansas is a national championship contender, in fact, along with Villanova and Oregon and Florida. But there's other teams in the mix. I think West Virginia is definitely a tournament team. Iowa State is probably going to get in, Oklahoma State. And then you kind of have these teams that are on the bubbles, like Kansas State, TCU, Texas Tech to a lesser extent. But I think next week is really going to be about those three teams and whether they can make some hay in that conference tournament and maybe get to the semifinals and pad their tournament resume. Unfortunately, the Texas Longhorns will not take place in any postseason tournament this year. They are in the midst of their worst season in 33 years at Texas. They're 10-20. Shaka Smart's worst season in his professional basketball life. What has gone wrong this year for that team, Nathan?
I think it can be sort of, I wouldn't say it gets summed up in three ways, but the three things that stick out to me is one, just like the lack of development with that trio of sophomores. I mean, we'll talk a bit more about what happened to Tevin Mack, but I mean, he did get suspended for pretty much most of Big 12 play, and he was at that point he was the leading scorer of this team, and seemed to be the only one of the three to have improved over the offseason. I mean, Eric Davis took a huge step back this year. And I know he was able to sort of improve within season and not be as bad as he was at the beginning. But I mean, like, he was far and away the worst player on this team at the beginning of the season. So the fact that he's able to improve a little bit from there is not exactly a high bar to jump over. And Curran Roach, I mean, granted, like he didn't drop off as much as Eric Davis did from last season to this season. But I mean, Curran Roach was supposed to be considered at least like maybe someone that could develop into the primary ball handler, at least for this season. But he too also really struggled and took a small step back, if at the very least. The other thing too is that Shaka Smart, as much as I like him and I think he should stay a Longhorns coach for at least the next 4 years or 4 to 5 years. I mean, unless like things get real bad real quick for keep staying this bad for that long. Shaka Smart was pretty stubborn in terms of still refusing to not stop starting Shaq Claire. Say that 5 times fast. But he kept starting Shaq Claire at the 5 and Jarrett Allen at the 4. Even though that never really was his like brand or his style back at VCU. I mean, back at VCU, he was like, you have one big man and then a bunch of like speedy guards and forwards around that. And then you just use that to create havoc and whatnot. But the fact that he tried sort of playing a more like traditional role, even though that meant like starting someone who, like, I mean, granted, I like Shaq Claire. Shaq Claire is a very good person. From what I've seen and heard and seen him interact. He's also like, he's really not that good. No offense to him, he's just not that good. And so the fact that he sort of stuck with that, even though that meant like losing more games, was frustrating to watch. And then like on top of that, like going back to like something I touched on a little bit, but the lack of a primary ball handler, turnovers have killed this team every night. And I mean, granted, Andrew Jones seems to have at least like developed somewhat as a primary ball handler, but just like going into this year without anyone that had a lot of experience playing point guard, that I think kind of like marked a bit of a death knell. So I mean, they really could have used Isiah Taylor this year, but
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I think your points are right on. I think not having that point guard, I think in the modern basketball age, you really can't have the point guard play that they've had and be successful. It's a point guard driven game, and if you don't have one that can consistently get the team into their sets and a turnover free basketball from that position, you're not going to be successful. And I think next year it's going to help with Matt Coleman coming in, a 4-star recruit, and you're going to get more growth hopefully from those sophomores that will be juniors. But the Tevin Mack situation was just horrendous. What's happened to that kid and what impact he had on the team, because he was a leading scorer before he got suspended. And you also had like nagging injuries to Kendall Yancey as well. So I do think you got to give Shaka another season. To me, we'll see what happens next year. I hope the team has enough talent that they should be able to bounce back and maybe get back into the tournament. But right now, Steve Patterson, the athletic director who hired Charlie Strong and Shaka Smart, It looks like he might be 0 for 2 with his hires, the way things are going right now.
I mean, although in all fairness to Patterson, I mean, like everyone was saying that like Shaka Smart was like one of the hottest basketball coaching prospects out there. So I mean, if Shaka flames out here, like Patterson's not going to be the only one that was surprised. I will say that. I guess we should go on to shout-outs and I guess kind of continue with that. Happy trails to Tevin Mack. He's no longer going to be with the Longhorn team. He just applied for his release and was granted that, and now he's going to be transferring elsewhere. Your thoughts, man? I know you touched a bit on it, but if you want to elaborate, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he was the leading scorer of the team this year before he got suspended. And last year, he was pretty good as a freshman. And so, I mean, he really had promise. He, as you mentioned, he was going to go with Shaka Smart to VCU, and then he changed his commitment and followed him here to Texas. And to see how that relationship has soured the past year and a half or so is really none of the parties involved expected this.
No, not at all. I mean, like it's hard to explain what happened. I mean, and the only way that the only thing that comes to my mind has been like sort of like, to me, like at first I thought was kind of a nasty rumor, but like, I mean, to see that relationship deteriorate so quickly, especially considering like how Shaka sort of like prides himself in having a good relationship with all his players, to see it deteriorate in such a way to the point that like Tevin Mack felt that he had to pretty much leave this team in order to have success kind of speaks to like maybe this being true. And I don't know if I should talk about this in terms of, since it's again, like, let me reiterate, this is a rumor. It was kind of a nasty rumor that was never really like kind of gotten rid of, but basically there were rumors that he had an argument with Kerwin Roach, and some reports said that it got very physical. Others said that it was just very heated, but I mean, it's looking more like that incident must have so hard to come back from, that there was just like no way for him to come back to this team and fit in.
Yeah. Other kind of UT basketball news, Isiah Taylor, who we mentioned, went to the NBA this past year. He hasn't really caught on with a team, but he got a 3-year deal with the Houston Rockets. He was in their summer league team, and he was playing with RGV, their NBA developmental league team, and he gets a long-term deal. I think this is a classic Daryl Morey contract. It's a low risk, potential high reward. I know Taylor has worked on his jump shot a lot this past year, and so that was kind of his knock at Texas, and his biggest kind of limitation was his inability to hit three-pointer, which is so emphasized at the NBA level. And so good for him. I mean, he's not going to have an impact on this team this year, but maybe down the road next year or the year after, he has a chance to get on this team, because the Rockets really don't have a lot of point guard depth per se. Patrick Beverley is more like an off guard, and you have James Harden, who's really running the point guard and handles a lot of the ball. And so you need guards that can defend and play make a little bit, as well as knock down the open three.
Yeah, definitely. Kudos to him for sure.
Yeah, and the final shout out is the MLS season is back. Houston Dynamo, specifically, they won the Desert Diamond Cup, which I mentioned last week, which is a preseason tournament in Tucson, Arizona. And so, I mean, not a big deal. It's a preseason tournament that is played by a lot of backups and guys that won't make the team. But the winning culture has been lacking from this team the last couple of years since they made the MLS Cup in 2012. And so they have a long road to get back to the playoffs. There's 22 teams in the league now, 11 in each conference, and so the top 6 make it. So it's a little tougher to get in the playoffs now, but I think the team speed, as I have mentioned the past couple of podcasts, is going to be a lot different this year with Romeo Kyoto and Albert Feliz on the wings. Hopefully you have Eric Cubo Torres, who's their DP big name, who hasn't contributed any goals yet since he joined the team 2 years ago. Hopefully him being reunited with the head coach Wilmer Cabrera will lead him to success. You have a lot of youth and speed, as well as veterans on this team. And so I think they have an outside shot of making the playoffs and making a run at that 6th seed in the Western Conference. The West is just so tough, just like basketball. Seattle, they play tonight, is the defending champ, and they have so many playmakers with the return of Clint Dempsey, Jordan Morris, Nicholas Ladero, who was really the MVP and sparked that team to winning the championship in the second half of last year. But MLS started last night, and it kicks off with the Dynamo today. FC Dallas as well. They won the Supporters Shield in the U.S. Open Cup last year. They're in the CONCACAF Champions League semifinals now. They have a stacked team as well, and so
I from what I've
another
heard,
winning team for Dallas, maybe.
Maybe. Well, yeah, another winning team until it's the playoffs, and then fall a little bit short. But yeah, nonetheless, definitely. But yeah, I mean, if just to add like one more thing, like I mean, in terms of just like their relations to each other, if I remember correctly, like the Dynamo are trying to like follow the lead of FC Dallas in terms of like emphasizing homegrown development. So
right,
like it's already to pay off big dividends already. So.
Yeah, I mean, bigger picture, that's what's really keeping MLS from joining the elite leagues. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a financial gap between teams in La Liga and English Premier League and some of those European leagues and the American League where you just can't pay the stars. But I think player development is really key. It's a lot of the academies in the league have not been successful. The Dynamo Academy, especially, there's so much talent in the Houston area, and for the team to never have really tapped into that market is troubling for the development of the game in this country. FC Dallas is really, their academy has cranked out star after star, and is one of the top academies in the league. And it's the model that for MLS to continue to grow is to have that homegrown talent grow up with the team from 14, 15 years old, and eventually play for the senior team and make an impact. And so I think that's something that MLS is trying to emphasize, and FC Dallas is definitely leading the way in that.
For sure, definitely. Yeah, and that pretty much wraps it up for this past week. Definitely been a busy week in sports. Let's hope for at least another busy week as well for this upcoming week. Talk to you later, man.
Yeah, talk to you next week.